Hello and welcome back, all our ABA Acers. You're listening to ABA Unlock, the ABA podcast where we get to talk about various topics with various professionals. Today we have our guest speaker, Miriam Zulfikar, and we will be speaking with her about behavioral interventions to treat sexually inappropriate behaviors. So Miriam, we're going to get right into this topic. Can you please talk to us about what are sexually inappropriate behaviors?
That is a very good question. And what we can really do is look at the literature to address this. So Reyes and colleagues have done multiple extensive studies of interventions of sexual behavior in the prison system for individuals with IDD. And they have outlined the definition of inappropriate sexual behavior as arousal to underage stimuli, often boys and girls who are minors.
So that's a very criminal look at the standpoint from the criminal justice system. So when we talk about these arousals, we're talking about 18 years old as the cutoff. What happens when we see a 60-year-old, 70-year-old, maybe an older individual who has that arousal for someone who's maybe 18 years old in 1 month, or maybe 19 years old, where that's still not socially appropriate sexual behaviors? Is that something we intervene on?
So I say your question is definitely a huge limitation in the field where we're talking about sexual behaviors, only because at that point we are to assume that the education or the teaching for the social sort of structure around sexual behavior has just been missed completely. They don't know how to meet those sexual needs in an appropriate way, and thus we get situations like this where 60-year-olds are aroused by an 18-year-old.
Well, does that mean that we need to put more emphasis on behavioral interventions or early education?
I'd say a mixture of both. I'm definitely in favor of both, especially at a younger age. The rate of success that we can find in intervening on these behaviors would be much, much more successful than, in your example, a 60-year-old who has sort of fixated in this type of behavior.
The next question I wanted to ask you, Miriam, is what is the significance of treating these kinds of behaviors?
So around 28% of individuals with IDD end up engaging in various illegal sexual behavior over their lifetime. This can look like something like public urination to, on the other end of the spectrum, child molestation. So it's very, very important to intervene on these behaviors.
Well, it seems when it comes to social significance that these statistics might be lower than certain other behaviors that might be just as harmful. So how do we prioritize intervention on such behaviors?
The reason I would prioritize is that a behavior like illegal sexual behavior can have judicial ramifications. So they can have consequences that they may have to face over their entire lifetime. And this is especially a problem when we see that Lindsay and colleagues found that the number of sex offenders with IDD are adjudicated at much, much higher rates than those in the general population. So they can suffer those consequences of not being able to receive frequent intervention, have the supports they need because they are in jail for this behavior. Additionally, a lot of these offenders with IDD begin to engage in these illegal sexual behaviors in their adolescence. And all of these figures really, really push forward that we do need to intervene, and we need to intervene at an early age.
So let's get more into those, the nitty-gritty details of the ABA concepts, the science behind this field. We talk a lot about functions of behaviors. So when it comes to sexually inappropriate behaviors, what are the underlying functions here?
So let's first look at a social stance on what the function of this behavior occurring is. So often children with developmental disabilities have much fewer social opportunities with peers and generally require explicit instruction to acquire appropriate sexual behavior. This can often impede a child's awareness of the social rules governing sexual behavior and cause them to become more frequent in their lifetime. So from a behavioral standpoint, we use traditional functional assessments to assess the function of any given behavior. They are controversial, especially with sexual behavior, as they inherently involve technical and ethical issues that typically prevent behavior analysts from using them to assess the function of sexual behaviors.
Although most traditional approaches to functional behavior assessments may not be suitable for this type of behavior, there are other procedures, such as antecedent only functional analyses. There's precursor functional analyses, or even functional analyses with extended no interaction conditions. What do you think about these kinds of functional analyses?
So, despite the existence of these procedures, there's still a lack of research done using them to assess the function of sexual behavior. So, in order for them to gain absolute merit as a tool specifically for sexual behavior, there needs to be much more thorough research and replication that has to be done in using them for sexual behavior.
So, Miriam, my next question will be, what are the current interventions available in the literature?
So, to address this question, I want to talk about David and colleagues and how they did a massive comparative study on different behavioral interventions for sexual behavior, their strengths, their limitations, especially in regards to the nature of sexual behavior. So, this comparative study included instructional revisions, manipulation of motivating operations, non contingent reinforcement, differential reinforcement of zero rates of behavior, extinction, and punishment. As we can see in the chart, the potential limitations for every single behavior intervention is much, much larger and longer than all of the potential strengths. Let's look at the next slide. Even punishment, which we know to be the strongest yet very much so the most unethical form of behavioral intervention, has a long list of potential limitations, one of them even including the risk of posing injury to the individual.
Wow, I was not expecting this much evidence-based research to have so many limitations with them as well. It's such a huge problem within the research and a problem that the field is facing right now.
And this should really be a wake up call for the professionals in the ABA setting to look at a different, more ethical, more socially valid approach to addressing sexually inappropriate behavior. What we see now is that we don't have the right tools to address this issue right now.
Yeah. Now, what kind of controversies are there in general in terms of actually stepping in and intervening on these behaviors?
So I'd say one of the biggest controversies would be just in the nature of ABA, which often requires direct observation of behaviors, which can, again, inherently cross professional and ethical lines in the realm of therapeutic service, especially when looking at sexual behaviors. Accurate measurement of inappropriate sexual behaviors would require an essential breach of privacy. However, since ABA is data driven, this collection would be pertinent to informing decisions regarding intervention. This obstacle could lead to difficulty in all phases of intervention, including functional behavioral assessments. Overall, the current research available for ethical, standardized methods of intervening on inappropriate or illegal sexual behavior is just very limited.
So it seems like direct observations is violating clients' rights to dignity, privacy, and confidentiality, whereas indirect measures are not an accurate measurement system that we can use to develop effective interventions. Should we be using indirect assessments and maintaining clients' rights, or should we be using direct interventions and circumventing the client's dignity?
So I think this comes down to an issue of assent and consent and what that truly means in an intervention for sexually inappropriate behaviors, which is, again, very, very contentious socially, behaviorally. And this would really require a sort of a reassessment into the ethical and social measures of applying ABA principles to reduce sexual behavior.
Antecedent behaviors are very big within the field of ABA when it comes to understanding why these behaviors are happening, or the likelihood of certain behaviors occurring. So let's talk about these precursors. What are the precursors of inappropriate sexual behaviors before we know we can intervene?
So precursors for behavior often just refer to initial behavioral indicators that may be mild or somewhat unrelated, and they can predict the likeliness of a certain behavior emerging in the future, such as illegal sexual behavior. So we've seen this list before from Koch and IQs of precursors for sexual behavior in children. So it's recommended that parents take a cooperative approach with therapists to teach and implement sex education. However, a lot of parents fear more that their children will be sexually assaulted more than their child engaging in sexually inappropriate behaviors. Due to this assumption, it may be likely that parents may leave these smaller inappropriate sexual behaviors unchecked, which in turn can develop into illegal sexual behaviors in the future.
It's very interesting because I feel like this is still very hypothetical. We know these precursors exist and we know we see illegal sexual behaviors in the future, but there's nothing on the statistics of the likelihood of actually seeing these behaviors and the likelihood of engaging in sexually inappropriate behaviors because a lot of kids could engage in these precursors but not have any illegal sexual activity later on in life.
I totally agree, Taz. This really calls for more longitudinal studies into the risk factors and their future implications.
So, Miriam, my next question is what is the role of acquiring assent in treating sexually inappropriate behaviors?
So, assent for intervention on sexual behavior is essentially not discussed in current literature. Future research should really assess the role or lack of assent in consent, as well as the potential risk factors associated with having and not having them.
So, why is assent so important in this type of intervention?
Again, it's due to the nature of ABA. There's a lot of ways that intervention for sexual behavior will violate very intimate private moments.
Then, do we violate the same privacy when we teach independent toileting? And does this differ?
So I see how the aspect of nudity would make it seem similar, but the function of peeing and the function of sexual gratification are very, very different. Assent is also a huge factor. We often get asked for help by parents or by the child for toileting. However, sexual behavior and intervention around it would require a higher understanding of that assent.
Yeah, very true. So, Miriam, how do we fill all these gaps that we talked about? Like, what is the next step, an immediate first steps in research that we need to be pushing for right now?
So in the future, researchers will need to create a structurally agreed upon measure of social and ethical validity that would work around the pre-existing obstacles of intervention that exist for inappropriate sexual behavior. Additionally, reliable longitudinal studies should be conducted assessing the correlation of known precursors to the likelihood of engaging in illegal sexual behavior in the future. If not, at least the lines between inappropriate sexual behavior and illegal sexual behavior need to become stricter and more well-defined according to Asian IDD characteristics. In this way, researchers may be able to collectively agree upon when it is behaviorally pertinent to intervene at lower levels of inappropriate sexual behavior at younger ages.
Thank you, Miriam. That was very well put. These steps are very attainable, and I hope future people can look more into going about achieving these measures and ways of conducting studies that can be beneficial to everybody involved.
I'd just like to say thank you for having me on the show today.
No worries. Miriam has left for all our AB Acers today a bunch of references if anybody would like to follow up with all the information that was spoken about in this podcast. AB Acers, I will see you next week in our talk about criminal justice reform. Thank you so much and see you guys next week.